October 22nd, 1971. Frank Lucas is sitting across from two Lucchese family representatives. The deal is done. He's reaching for the pen. Then a door opens, the wrong door. A gun presses against his temple. 4 seconds of silence. And then Calvin Price, the man who had stood behind Frank Lucas's left shoulder for 3 years without ever once drawing his weapon, made a decision in under 2 seconds that no one in that room ever forgot. This is what happened next. October 22nd, 1971. 9:14 p.m. A private room above Patsy's restaurant on West 56th Street, Manhattan. The kind of room where the city's noise didn't reach. No music, no street traffic, no voices from downstairs. Just the particular silence of men who had learned, over many years, that silence itself was a form of authority. Frank Lucas sat at the table with 3 of his most trusted lieutenants. Across from him, 2 representatives of the Lucchese family, men whose names had never appeared in a newspaper and never would. Between them, a deal that had been 6 weeks in the making. A distribution arrangement covering the garment district and the lower Bronx. Clean, simple, mutually profitable. The kind of agreement that kept streets quiet and money moving. It should have been a formality. It almost ended in a bloodbath. What happened in that room in the next 4 minutes would become the most whispered story in the New York underworld for the next decade. Not because of what was said. Because of what almost happened. Because of a man named Calvin Price, who had been standing behind Frank Lucas's left shoulder for 3 years, and who on that particular October evening made a decision in less than 2 seconds that changed the trajectory of every person in that room. To understand what Calvin Price did, you need to understand what he was. Calvin Price was not a large man. 5 feet 11, 170 pounds, the build of a man who moved quickly and quietly and preferred not to be noticed until the moment when being noticed was the only thing that mattered. He had grown up in the South Bronx in circumstances that had taught him early that the world was divided into 2 kinds of people. Those who waited to see what happened and those who decided what happened. Calvin Price had decided, at approximately age 14, that he belonged to the second category. He had come to Frank Lucas through a chain of introductions so careful and deliberate that by the time he stood in a room behind Lucas's shoulder he had been vetted by 7 different people whose judgment Lucas trusted absolutely. He did not drink. He did not gamble. He did not talk about his work to anyone, including his own family. He had one job, to make sure Frank Lucas left every room he entered in the same condition he had arrived. In 3 years, Calvin Price had never once drawn his weapon. That was about to change. The meeting had been going smoothly. The Lucchese representatives, a heavy-set man named Sal DeMaria and a thinner, quieter man everyone called Needle, had arrived with the expected courtesies and the expected paperwork. The numbers were acceptable. The territory lines were clear. Frank Lucas had asked 2 questions, received 2 satisfactory answers, and was reaching for his pen. That was when the door opened. Not the main door, through which DeMaria and Needle had entered, and through which 2 of Lucas's men stood watch in the hallway outside. The other door. The interior door that connected the private dining room to the kitchen service area. The door that was supposed to be locked. The door that nobody had checked because in 6 weeks of planning nobody had thought to ask who had access to it. The man who came through that door was named Bruno Cesar. He was 26 years old, and he was carrying a .38 revolver in his right hand, and he was not supposed to be there. Bruno Cesar was the nephew of a Lucchese capo whose name carried considerable weight in certain rooms. He was also, as Frank Lucas would later learn, a young man with something to prove and very little understanding of the difference between proving something and destroying everything. Bruno Cesar had not been sent. He had come on his own. He had heard, through the particular osmosis by which young men in that world absorb information they are not meant to have, that his uncle's representatives were meeting with Frank Lucas tonight. And Bruno Cesar had decided, with the specific stupidity of a 26-year-old who had confused proximity to power with possession of it, that tonight was the night he would show everyone what he was capable of. What he was capable of, as it turned out, was very nearly ending 4 lives and a business arrangement that had taken 6 weeks to construct. He came through the door fast, the gun already up, and in the half-second before anyone else in the room fully processed what was happening he had crossed to the table and pressed the barrel of the revolver against Frank Lucas's left temple. The room went the kind of still that has nothing to do with silence. It was the stillness of bodies that have stopped processing anything except the single most important fact in their immediate environment. Di Maria and Needle both froze. Lucches's two lieutenants on either side of him froze. Even Bruno Sessa himself, having arrived at the moment he had been building toward in his own mind for months, seemed briefly arrested by the reality of it. 4 seconds. That was approximately how long the tableau held. In those 4 seconds, Frank Lucchese did not move. His hand was still extended toward the pen. His body was still angled slightly forward in the posture of a man about to sign his name. His face, those who were present would later say, changed not at all. Not a flinch, not a tightening around the eyes, not the involuntary catch of breath that overtakes almost every human being when a loaded weapon makes contact with their skull. Frank Lucchese simply stopped moving and waited, with the patience of a man who had already decided that panic was the one thing he could not afford. What he could not see, because the man was directly behind him, was Calvin Price. Calvin Price had seen Bruno come through the door before anyone else in the room registered the movement. He had spent 3 years training himself to watch every entrance in every room simultaneously, and the interior door had been in his peripheral vision from the moment they sat down precisely because it was the door that concerned him most. When Bruno moved, Calvin Price had already begun to respond. But responding, in his particular line of work, did not mean reacting. It meant deciding. In 2 seconds, Calvin Price made several calculations simultaneously. He calculated the angle and pressure of the gun against Lucches's temple and determined from the trembling of Bruno Sessa's arm that the young man was frightened, which made him more dangerous than a calm man with a gun but less dangerous than a calm man with a gun and a clear intention. He calculated the positions of Di Maria and Needle and determined that neither was reaching for a weapon, which meant this was not a coordinated hit, which meant the Lucchese family did not know this was happening, which meant there was a version of this situation that did not end in war. He calculated the distance between himself and Bruno Sessa, the angle required, the noise it would make, the aftermath. And then Calvin Price drew his weapon. Not dramatically. Not with announcement. With the particular economy of motion that comes from doing something so many times in practice that the body no longer requires instruction from the mind. He pressed the barrel of his own gun against the back of Bruno Sessa's neck. Quietly, in a voice that carried to every person in the room but no further, Calvin Price said 3 words. Put it down. There are moments when the architecture of a situation becomes visible to everyone in the room simultaneously. This was one of those moments. Bruno Sessa understood, in the specific clarity that physical fear produces, that the geometry had shifted completely. He had entered the room holding all the leverage. He was now holding none of it. The gun at Frank Lucches's temple was still a threat, but it was a threat with a consequence attached to it, and the consequence was immediate and certain and could not be negotiated. Di Maria and Needle had not moved. They were watching the 2 guns and performing the same calculation that rational men in their position always perform. The calculation was simple. Whatever happened next was not their doing and not their problem unless they made it their problem. They had not moved when Bruno came through the door, and they did not move now. Frank Lucches's 2 lieutenants had their hands on the table. Still. Visible. This was deliberate. It was the clearest possible signal to everyone in the room that the situation was not going to be complicated further from that direction. 8 seconds had passed since Bruno Sessa came through the door. In the 9th second, Bruno Sessa lowered the gun. Not all the way. Halfway. The barrel dropped from Lucches's temple to approximately the level of his ear. It was not compliance. It was hesitation. The hesitation of a man who had built a version of this moment in his mind in which he had all the power, and who was now discovering that the version in his mind bore no resemblance to the version in the room. Calvin Price pressed his barrel slightly harder against the back of Bruno's neck. The gun went down to the table. Frank Lucchese finally moved. He straightened in his chair. He adjusted the cuff of his left sleeve, the one closest to where the gun had been pressed, as if checking that the fabric had not been disturbed. He picked up the pen he had been reaching for. He looked at Di Maria. He said, without any particular emphasis, "You should take your friend home." Di Maria and Needle exchanged a look that carried an entire conversation in it. Di Maria stood. He walked to Bruno Sessa, who was still standing at the table with Calvin Price's gun at his neck, and he took the young man by the arm with the particular grip of someone who is not interested in what the other person wants. He said something in Italian, low and fast, and Bruno Sessa went with him through the door they had originally come in, not the kitchen door, and then they were gone. Needle remained at the table. He looked at Frank Lucchese for a moment. Then he said, "This won't happen again." It was not an apology. It was a statement of operational fact, the kind of assurance that meant something precisely because it came without decoration. Frank Lucas nodded once. He put the pen to the paper and signed his name. The meeting concluded 11 minutes later. The terms were exactly what they had been before Bruno Cesar came through the kitchen door. The distribution arrangement was finalized. The territory lines were confirmed. Both parties left through the front entrance. Calvin Price was the last one out. He stopped in the doorway and looked back at the room for a moment. The kitchen door was still open. He walked over and closed it. Then he walked out. In the car on the way back to Harlem, Frank Lucas said nothing for 6 blocks. Then he said, without turning from the window, "How long did you know about the kitchen door?" Calvin Price, in the front passenger seat, said from the moment we sat down. Lucas said nothing for another 2 blocks. Then he said, "I know." It was the longest conversation they had about what happened in that room. What happened to Bruno Cesar in the weeks that followed was not something that Frank Lucas arranged. He did not need to. The Lucchese family had their own methods for addressing the specific kind of problem that Bruno Cesar represented, and those methods had nothing to do with Frank Lucas's preferences or instructions. What Lucas understood, and what his restraint in that room had communicated more clearly than any threat could have, was that the situation had been managed correctly. No shots fired. No bodies. No war. The deal stood. The Don whose hand shook, it was said afterward in the particular shorthand that the street develops for moments it needs to remember, was not Frank Lucas. Frank Lucas's hand had been reaching for a pen and he had signed it without trembling. The hand that shook was Bruno Cesar's. When Calvin Price pressed the barrel of his gun against the back of Bruno's neck, everyone in that room had seen Bruno's gun hand begin to vibrate with the specific tremor of a body that has finally understood the distance between imagining something and doing it. Word of what happened spread, as such things always spread, through the careful channels by which the underworld transmits information it considers significant. The story changed in the telling, as stories always do. In some versions, Calvin Price had disarmed Bruno Cesar in under a second. In others, Frank Lucas had spoken first, calm words that broke Bruno's nerve before Calvin moved. In one version that circulated in certain Bronx social clubs, Lucas had never stopped reaching for the pen, had signed the document with the gun still at his head, and had handed it to Di Maria without looking up. That version was false. But it was the version that people wanted to believe, which told its own story about what Frank Lucas had come to represent in that world. What was true, and what every version of the story preserved regardless of the embellishments, was this. In a room where 4 seconds of chaos could have produced a decade of war, Frank Lucas had not moved. He had not panicked. He had not reached for his own weapon, had not escalated, had not given Bruno Cesar the reaction that might have convinced the young man that pulling the trigger was his only remaining option. He had simply sat and waited, with the absolute stillness of a man who trusted the person behind his left shoulder the way other men trust the ground beneath their feet. And Calvin Price had been there. That was the thing about Frank Lucas that the 5 boroughs spent years learning and never quite finished understanding. It was never just him. The intelligence, the patience, the refusal to be provoked, those were his. But the architecture around him, the network of people who had been selected and positioned and trusted and never once given a reason to question that trust, that was also him. Every man behind his shoulder. Every woman keeping his books. Every driver who knew which route to take without being told. Every informant who passed information because they believed Frank Lucas was the kind of man who kept his word. Bruno Cesar, coming through that kitchen door with a gun and something to prove, had not walked into a room with Frank Lucas. He had walked into a room with everything Frank Lucas had built over 15 years. He had not understood the difference. He would not make that mistake again. Calvin Price retired from his position in 1974. He moved to Atlanta. He opened a dry cleaning business. By all accounts he was an excellent dry cleaner, punctual, precise, attentive to detail, and unlikely to be surprised by anything that came through the door. Frank Lucas, asked about that night many years later in one of the rare conversations in which he addressed it at all, said only that Calvin Price was the best investment he ever made. He was asked what he meant by investment. He said some men you pay for what they do. Calvin I paid for what he made possible. There's a difference. A man with a gun is useful. A man who makes you untouchable is something else entirely. He was asked what that something else was. He smiled and didn't answer. That is the story of October 22nd, 1971. The night a 26-year-old with something to prove walked into the wrong room and discovered, in the space of 4 seconds, the particular distance between thinking you hold all the cards and understanding who is actually sitting at the table. Bruno Cesar's hand shook. Frank Lucchese's did not. Calvin Price made sure of both. In the mathematics of power, that is the only equation that matters. Frank Lucchese said it himself years later. Some men you pay for what they do. Calvin he paid for what he made possible. In the game of power, it is never just the man at the table. It is everyone he trusted enough to put behind him. If this story hit different, subscribe, hit the bell, because the next one makes this look like a warm-up.